President of the United States.
In the audience are lawmakers, cabinet officials, diplomats, and Supreme Court justices. U.S. President Bush delivered his 6th annual State of the Union speech to a joint session of Congress at the U.S. Capitol in Washington. He also sought to push a domestic agenda against a heavy tide of criticism over Iraq. Calling climate change a serious challenge he would address by reducing U.S. gasoline use by 20% over 10 years and increasing use of alternative fuels.
It's in our vital interest to diversify America's energy supply. The way forward is through technology. We must continue changing the way America generates electric power by even greater use of clean coal technology, solar and wind energy, and clean, safe nuclear power.
In the hour-long speech, representatives and senators gave the president a standing ovation several times, with House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi showing support to the president. However, her position of opposing the Iraqi war is firm.
Ladies and gentlemen, on this day, at this hour, it is still within our power to shape the outcome of this battle. Let us find our resolve and turn events toward victory.
Facing defiant lawmakers and the weakest approval ratings of his 6 years in office, Bush said the best chance for success is to send more U.S. troops to Iraq, asking Congress to increase the size of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps. With the news poll giving Bush a 33% approval rating at the lowest level of his presidency. In the past 6 decades, has the president delivered his annual speech to the nation in a weaker condition in the polls. Richard M. Nixon in the crisis of Watergate in 1974. Bush reiterated the U.S. position on the nuclear programs of North Korea and Iran, vowing to respond firmly against Iran and seeking nuclear disarmament of North Korea through the six-party talk.
Welcome to this week's edition of Taiwan Outlook. I'm Chi-Chen Lo. Some critics have said that Bush administration's so-called neoconservative thinking has to be responsible for the somewhat isolated situation of the U.S. in the world and the difficulty in Iraq in particular. Is that a fair and accurate statement? Joining us today is Gary Schmitt, Executive Director of the Project for New American Century, a very important and leading think tank of the neoconservative team. Gary, welcome to our program.
Thanks for having me.
As a leading representative of so-called neoconservative team, how do you respond to that kind of criticism?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that the neoconservatives' influence is way overstated. I think the Bush administration has adopted a lot of policies that I would agree with. On the other hand, I think they've adopted them for their own reasons, not particularly because the neoconservatives, which aren't that many to begin with, are that influential. Second thing is, and I think this is, may seem like something of a cop-out, but the truth is a lot of neoconservatives have supported the president, but we've also been very critical of the way the president has carried out those policies. So in some ways we agree with the policies, but we've been very unhappy with their implementation. So what are the good policies you think that Bush administration has adopted in implementing its security policy? Well, I think the positive thing is that after a few years of the Republican Party, conservatives in particular, moving away from the Reagan agenda, which was to promote democracy, I think the Bush administration has done a good job of putting that back on the table for very sound security reasons. But again, the real problem there is how you go about implementing it. It's not easy, it's a long-term project, and at times the administration seems like they want this to happen tomorrow, which of course means that usually it fails, which is a problem. That's right. But what are the so-called negative criticisms about your neoconservative views of foreign policy? Well, again, the neoconservatives, are all over the map. I mean, there's a number of neoconservatives who are very supportive of, for example, the way the president conducted the war so far in Iraq. But then there were others, for example, my colleague Tom Donnelly and I wrote back in 2003 that there was an insurgency going on in Iraq, for example, and that we needed a proper counterinsurgency strategy. Well, we never did adopt a proper counterinsurgency strategy, and the result is I think things got out of control. Now, recently, the president has begun to implement such a strategy, and the real question is whether that strategy is too late or whether we still have a chance to make a good go of it in Iraq. But with the leaving of people like Don Rumsfeld and John Bolton, do you think that the so-called neoconservatives is losing influence in the making of U.S. foreign policy? Well, I guess we have to draw some distinctions. Don Rumsfeld never considered himself to be a neoconservative, and that's one of the problems we had in Iraq. Neoconservatives knew that we agreed with Don Rumsfeld that we should remove Saddam Hussein, but we were very concerned that, okay, that once we removed him, that we'd try to do our best job to try to promote a decent government in Iraq. Unfortunately, Mr. Rumsfeld never believed in that agenda. If you look very carefully at Mr. Rumsfeld's speeches before the war in Iraq, he never once mentioned democracy. And so the result is that he made a battle plan that was conducive for removing Saddam, but it wasn't conducive for actually reestablishing stability and peace in Iraq. So from neoconservative point of view, at least my point of view, it's a good thing that Mr. Rumsfeld's gone. And in that sense, I think it's a positive sign for those of us who are neoconservative.
But do you think it's necessary for the U.S. to bring more troops to Iraq now?
Yeah, I've thought for a long time that we needed more troops. Before the war, even, I argued that we needed 250,000 troops to provide stability. I wasn't worried about removing Saddam. I was worried about what happened next. And I think my worries have borne out, which is that we had too few troops. If you're going to allow people to progress, to have decent lives, they have to be secure on the streets.
That's right.
Fathers and mothers have to know that they can send their children to school without worrying about bombs. People have to know that they can open up their stores and not worry about bombs. And the lack of that kind of security just means that all the kinds of things that you would want to happen politically and socially just never will happen. Until you have security, the country can't move on.
Yeah, but there's a rise in domestic discontent in the U.S. right now. Do you fail to explain away some of those concerns?
Well, it's a little bit more ambiguous. I mean, this is clearly the case that the country is unhappy with the war in Iraq. But there are all these other polls that show that people are also concerned about a precipitous pullout of Iraq. In other words, people are unhappy with the way the Bush administration has conducted the war, and they think that it's been mostly a failure. On the other hand, polling data shows that if we pull out and there's a disaster, American public's upset about that too. Let me give you a very concrete example of the ambiguity in American foreign policy public opinion. It's true President Bush's polling numbers are way down. It's true that the November elections were somewhat a vote against him on Iraq. On the other hand, the two most popular politicians in the country right now are Rudy Giuliani and John McCain. And Mrs. Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Senator Clinton. Now, when you think about sort of those who want to pull out, they're not one of those. Neither of the three are that order. So,
that's right.
So again, the American public is looking for success as much as looking for to pull out.
But how do you read the findings of the so-called Iraq Study Group report?
I think it's a dead letter. I think it was clearly just it was a report that was designed to sort of ease our way out of it.
That's right.
I think the president was never interested in I mean, presidents have this fundamental fact. They don't want to be known as the presidents who've lost a war. And so the president, I think, to his credit, bucked popular opinion or public opinion, elite opinion in the United States and said, I want to see if we can try to win this. One of the reasons why the report was so positively received was because, of course, the war wasn't going well. And the result was that you had, in the abstract, this other way of proceeding. So it got a lot of good publicity because it wasn't what was going on in Iraq. As soon as it came out, it was quite striking. There was, both on the left and the right, there were a considerable number of criticisms. And it never really had the momentum that people thought it would when it finally was published. So,
but what was the result of the midterm election? Some sort of wake-up call or even warning sign for the Bush administration?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing they did was get rid of Mr. Rumsfeld, and now they've changed generals in Iraq, and I think correctly so. They've changed the strategy. The new general Petraeus is going to implement a policy, a counterinsurgency strategy for Baghdad, which has been sorely needed for several years. So now, you know, look, it's very late in the day, and it may be too difficult to succeed. But on the other hand, it's at least it's the right way to try to succeed.
Yeah, but how do you read the new political balance of power in Washington, with the so-called Democrats controlling the House and the Senate, and with the Republican administration?
What it means is the administration has about, I think, 7 to 9 months to show some progress in Iraq.
Will they do it?
If they don't show progress, then I think you're going to see the Democrats beginning to use the budget process, the appropriation process, to try to bring the war down to a close. If the administration's new policy in Iraq, new strategy of securing Baghdad shows progress, then I think the Democrats will have a hard time doing so. So the next 6 to 9 months are really quite critical.
Yeah, but some people argue that what happened in Iraq could have some demonstration effects for Iran and North Korea. How do you understand that?
Oh, I think that's true. I mean, personally, before the Iraq War and then right after Saddam's fall, I had discussions with very senior Iranian officials, and they were very solicitous. You know, sort of how can we work together and the like.
Yeah.
As soon as the United States was having problems in Iraq, they basically told me to go take a flying leap. So, you know, I don't. They read the situation in Iraq as tying us down, and it's given them, I think, sense of that they can get away with a lot more than probably they can.
So you think the U.S. government should get tougher on both cases?
Well, I think we have to be sensible. I mean, the truth is we have a lot of troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we can't go looking for new fights that we can't finish. On the other hand, if we have a problem with Iran, it's going to be both our Navy and our Air Force and our economic weight that will sort of carry the day. So Iran is a strange case because in some ways they're very vulnerable economically. Their economy is not doing well. With the price of oil dropping, they're straining to keep up with the demands at home. And they're for example, even on their oil, they have a lot of oil that they pump out of the ground, but in fact they don't refine much. They depend upon others to refine their oil. So. Iran is a very ambitious country right now, but on the other hand, it's a very vulnerable country. So I think the situation is a little bit better than many people think.
So do you think that Iran is easier to solve the problem than the North Korean case?
Yeah, probably. I think the North Koreans always have been much more difficult. I think much more isolated. It's very hard to sort of impinge upon them economically when they have no economy to speak of. Although I must say, they reacted so strongly to the sort of the work of the U.S. Treasury Department against their counterfeiting and other things. It seemed to suggest that hurt them quite a bit. So they may be a little bit more vulnerable than we thought. But in general, the Iranians are, the population as a whole, is much more open to the West. Their economy is much more integrated, so therefore, in that sense, it's a little bit more easier to have leverage over it. So I think on the whole, the Iranians are probably, it's a better case to sort of try to manage.
Will the U.S. government count on diplomatic approach particularly, or will they use force against Iran? Because there have been speculations about U.S. attacking Iran in the future.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so in the sense of we're looking for a fight. However, I do think that this is a president that at the end of the day doesn't believe that he wants to have both North Korea and Iran go nuclear on it. The consequences in the Middle East of a nuclear Iran are quite serious. They're far more serious than a nuclear North Korea, for example. You already have countries like Jordan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia talking about having their own nuclear programs. So things could get very, very out of control pretty quickly.
How about North Korea? Do you think the U.S. has done a good job in persuading or dissuading North Korea from getting nuclear weapons?
No. On the other hand, I'm quite convinced the North Koreans were determined to have nuclear weapons no matter what. Okay. So I don't think, absent China, mainland China putting real squeeze on North Korea, that we have much of a chance of stopping that.
But has China done a good job in containing North Korea?
No, they've done very little. I mean, they're afraid to squeeze North Korea because they're afraid that the consequences of a destabilized North Korea would have for them on refugees and also as a buffer. They want North Korea there. But I think the second issue is that for a long time, China has gotten credit for just trying to look like it's helping with the talks.
That's right.
And they like that, having that credit. So the longer the talks go on, the more leverage they have, they think, vis-a-vis U.S. policy. So in some ways, they had an incentive for the talks to go on and never to actually get anywhere. Now, I'm not sure that's going to be the case in the months ahead, but nevertheless, on the whole, China hasn't been that helpful.
But the result of which will be North Korea going nuclear. But as we know that China's policy has been a nuclear-free Korea Peninsula. Is that a contradiction?
Yeah, I think they've got different, and they have different things they want. I mean, they would rather not have North Korea be a nuclear nation, nuclear weapons nation. On the other hand, they also probably prefer, if they have to choose between a nuclear North Korea and a destabilized North Korea, they'll probably choose a nuclear North Korea. It's just, it's like a lot of foreign policy. There's a lot of things you would want, and then there's just the priorities of what you're going to get.
Yeah. So from what you just said, that six-party talks is not a viable and feasible option to solve the problem.
No, and I think there's a lot of talk in the United States right now and in the region, of course, that Assistant Secretary Chris Hill has cut a deal with North Korea that will reopen essentially the substantive talks and try to sort of freeze things to where they are. Those talks were done bilaterally. They weren't done through the six-party talks.
Yeah.
But
if this deadlock continues, is the time on your side or on North Korean side?
Both.
Could you explain that?
Well, I just think North Korea is still very much of a failing regime. It's its population is suffering greatly. There's no viability for it economically. It's very isolated. So over the long term, it's hard to imagine it's being able to sustain itself. On the other hand, in the short term, if you have both South Korea and China wanting to keep it propped up, they can, because it doesn't take much to sort of keep that regime sort of from falling. So because it's so poor. And so I think until South Korea's government changes or the government policy changes or China's policy changes, I think North Korea is pretty safe.
But do you think that the U.S. government should consider military option?
I think the military option has never been really on the table with North Korea. Ironically, the Bush administration is always thought to be sort of, gun happy, war happy. The closest we ever came to war since the Korean War was during the Clinton administration in the mid-90s. There were real plans that Secretary Perry at the time had in his hands to strike North Korea militarily. They wound up cutting a deal, and they didn't, but those plans were quite serious. The Bush administration is not interested in a military option vis-a-vis North Korea because I think they think the consequences in South Korea would be quite devastating. Yeah.
There seems to be a South Korean deviation from the U.S. strategy towards North Korea. How do you explain this kind of animosities or sometimes very uncomfortable relationship between the U.S. and Korea right now?
Well, largely, I think it's generational change. The end of the Cold War, you have people that grew up and came to maturity well after the end of the Korean War. And so they don't think of the United States in the same way that perhaps the older generation did. It's a similar phenomenon that we see in Germany, who's been a very close ally of the United States. But most of the leadership in Germany, for example, understood the United States stepped in after the World War II to help rebuild and protect Germany. The leaders that are there now don't have those memories, and so you're just going to get a different kind of alliance relationship. I think for too long we've kind of treated, precisely because during the Cold War what really mattered was what the U.S. policy was in South Korea and in Germany. We kind of created I think an irresponsible politics in both countries. Let me explain. It's sort of like you have a teenager and you never let him, sort of become an adult. And I think we're suffering from that. Yeah. On the other hand, and this is sort of even a larger issue, one of the most interesting things friends of mine have told me is that in both countries, the textbooks that talk about history and talk about America in particular are really quite negative. So you have sort of a generation of people who've been educated to think of the United States in a kind of negative way, and so I'm sure that's not helpful either. Yeah, whether
it's in the case of Iran or in the case of North Korea, China has been a very important player. So when we come back, we'll talk about the role of China and the Sino-US relationship. Let's take a short break, and we'll be right back.